Okay.
Welcome to Preserving Our Past, Informing Our Future, a limited podcast series produced through the School of Occupational Therapy at Texas Women's University. I'm Sydney Stevenson, a third-year occupational therapy doctoral student, and this series is a part of my capstone project in collaboration with the Blagg-Huey Library in Denton. This year, TWU celebrates its 125th anniversary, 125 years of educating, empowering, and advancing the professions that shape our communities. Occupational therapy has been the cornerstone of that mission, and there's perhaps no one more qualified to help us understand the profession's journey than our guest, Dr. Kathlyn Reed, known to most as Kitty, is a scholar, educator, and historian whose career spans more than 5 decades. She is the co-author of The History of Occupational Therapy, the First Century, a recipient of AOTA's Award of Merit, and the Eleanor Clark Slagle Lectureship. She is recognized among AOTA's 100 most influential people. Dr. Reed spent much of her career right here at Texas Women's University, where she shaped generations of occupational therapists. In this first episode, we'll hear how a chance conversation in a restaurant booth set a 13-year-old girl on the path to becoming occupational therapy's greatest chronicler. Dr. Reed, welcome and thank you for being here. So to get us started off, Dr. Reed, I love the story about how your father overheard two occupational therapists talking about their work with children at Mary Free Bed Hospital. And that's what sparked your interest. Can you take us back to that moment? And what was it about that description that captured your imagination?
Mary Free Bed Hospital is in Grand Rapids, Michigan. That's where we were living at the time. My father was at a restaurant because two salesmen had invited him out to lunch. They wanted him, obviously, to buy the products that they had for sale. He was not interested. So, although he was being polite by looking at them, he was actually eavesdropping on the conversation of two therapists behind him. Of course, he didn't know that. And they were simply shop talking, probably talking about some clients that maybe they shouldn't have been talking about in a restaurant, but but they were anyway. And apparently, of course, I don't have a record of the conversation per se, but they were talking about what activities or occupations they felt might be helpful for the clients. And of course, these were children, so they were obviously going to be art and craft kinds of activities. My father knew that I was reasonably good at crafts, and my mother had taught me a number of crafts over the years. And so he thought that sounded interesting. And so when he came home, he said I should look into, what these therapists said they were. And they were saying that they were OT, and he managed to get that translated to occupational therapy.
Mm-hmm.
Now, had he known that OT required a doctoral, or excuse me, a bachelor's degree at that point, he would have dropped the conversation at that point because I was not considered college material at that point. My mother had been told when I was 4 years old and flunked kindergarten that she had to accept the fact that I was slow. My first grade teacher told my mother that if my mother, did not teach me to read, I would never learn because the school system was not set up to deal with children who had the kinds of problems. I don't think they used the word disability back then. The kinds of problems that I presented. So my mother did teach me how to read. And, well, until I was about 8, I couldn't read the broadside of a barn. I simply did not have the visual capacity. I was born with what's known as strabismus, which is one of those diagnoses that has endless descriptions, many of which don't describe the kinds of condition that I actually had. But it did definitely interfere with my ability to learn. I may also have had a learning disability at this point, because they didn't diagnose those kinds of things back then. It's hard to tell how much of my academic problems were due to my strabismus or visual problems, or other problems, or a combination of.
Yes.
Uh, the reason I flunked kindergarten is because they thought I was very uncoordinated, and my mother would have vouched for that. That's why she put me in nursery school, because she thought I was clumsy. And again, that may have been primarily, they said they put glasses on me when I was 2.5. Now, they didn't know about prisms back then. These were real glasses, not plastic
Mm-hmm.
like the ones I'm wearing now. So they were bifocals, but they were not prisms. So they were not attempting to coordinate my eyes together. They were simply trying to improve my farsightedness, which is
Mm-hmm.
apparently very common with people who have strabismus. So how much of my failure to be able to do things is related to vision and or other brain injury, not able to be recorded at this point. Somewhere around the age of 8, apparently my system began to function a little bit better. Exactly why is also not discernible at this point. One thing I know about having a doctorate in special education and taking the courses because I was interested in whether I could figure out some of my own disability. I learned that reading test changes about 8 or about 3rd grade, so that you're not spending less time decoding the symbols on the page and spending more time understanding what those words are actually trying to tell you. That may have clicked. So slowly, as I got into 5th grade, I started to be able to actually could read. So my father did find me a career, to go back to the beginning of our
Mm-hmm.
question. And although later vocational testing suggested that OT was really not the best career for me, that I should have been either a speech pathologist, a YWCA, counselor, I stuck with OT.
And what made you want to stick with OT?
Basically, I think because I didn't find, in spite of the fact that, many of my fellow friends, in college were, were into different careers, and some of them were, changing from one thing to another and saying, well, I like this, I don't like that. I didn't ever find anything that seemed to fit me any better. I said it in my first semester in college at 6 weeks exam time. I got a D in physics. And at that point, my parents were ready to pull me out of college, but I managed to get a C in the final grade, so they let me stay. And I said, other than seeing my friends talk about, you know, their issues or concerns, it didn't seem to me that anything that was out there, this was University of Wisconsin in Madison at that time, fit me any better. So I stuck it out.
No, that's amazing. Thank you for sharing that. I was also going back to a little bit about arts and crafts that you were talking about at the beginning of
Mhm.
the answer to the last question. You managed the hobby section of your parents' paint and wallpaper shop as a young
Yes.
girl. Do you see a connection between those early experiences with arts and crafts and what you would eventually do in occupational therapy?
Yeah, my father actually was a research chemist, but when I was 17, he and his employer were not seeing eye to eye, and he basically quit. And as a very much a second career, he bought a paint and wallpaper store in Beloit, Wisconsin, which also sold wallpaper and had a hobby section. Now, the hobby section was primarily kits, most of which were plastic, although some were still wood or combination. And so you could build a kit, mostly cars, ships, airplanes, a couple of train kind of boxcars kind of things. And there was an art supply, primarily primarily oil-based paints, canvases. So it was not really a craft
Mm-hmm.
thing, unless you consider the kits to be crafty. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
so there was no, we didn't sell yarn or embroidery thread or pre-printed kinds of fabric things. The work at the store was primarily a case of the division of labor.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, my father handled the paint, varnishes section. My mother took care of the wallpaper, and that left me with the kits and art supplies. That created me an automatic job during the summer and all breaks from school. I never had to hunt for or apply for a summer or like Christmas break job. Mine was built in. And in fact, it overlapped much of my schoolwork because I was still helping with ordering the supplies. I'll say in certain craft classes that we were taking, I had a ready source for the supplies. I could order them for myself, or in some cases, we already had them at the store. So in that sense, I guess the craft supply helped me. But I think more than helping with the arts and crafts courses, which we took lots of back then. It helped me when we were talking about managing or administrating an OT department or clinic. I obviously had business experience built in. So I knew about having to get a business license. I knew about obviously ordering. I knew about organizing things for sale. I had participated in all kinds of fairs for businesses. I had literally gone into warehouses to order stuff. So I knew a lot of things that students who maybe had a typical part-time job, flipping burgers, was available even back then.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, you know, Well, I guess another thing that you do learn there that I learned was, a lot about interfacing with the clients, people who want to buy things, trying to understand, and ask the right questions so that you could get the right answers. One of my favorite ones in the store was, so people would come in and say, I need some paint. And then, of course, you had to follow that up with, well, what are you trying to paint? What color did you have in mind? So you learned how to interview, I guess you might say. Those skills probably were more useful to me in OT school than the fact that I helped sell art and craft
Mm-hmm.
activity.
No, I can see how that would be really helpful in a lot of different ways. Going back to your education a little bit. So, when you were earning your BS in OT, that's where you picked up your nickname, Kitty. Can you tell us a little bit about that story and what your educational experience was like back then?
Yeah, so lived in a dorm the first 3 years I was in college. And for some reason, there were a bunch of people whose name was like Catherine or Kathleen or Catherine. And back then, we did not have individual phones in our rooms. There were phones in the hallway, at each hallway. So when the phone rang, somebody got out of their room and answered the phone and to ask, whom the person wanted to speak to. Well, between the Kathy and the Katie and the Catherine and the Kathleen, and it was getting to be too much. There would be three or four of us all trying to figure out who the caller was really trying to contact. So I decided I knew how to solve that problem. So I decided to use the name Kitty because no one else was using that, and that was distinctive from Catherine or Kathy or Katie or Carrie or the nickname just ended up sticking throughout the years. It ended up solving a lot of the who are we talking about problems.
Yes, no, that makes sense. Can you tell me a little bit more about your educational experience during the time that you were getting your BS in OT?
Okay. The program in OT, of course, at that point was quite different from what it is now. The first semester as a freshman, we had the Intro to OT course. That's pretty much the only specific OT course we had until the junior year. At the University of Wisconsin, where I started, Basically, we were in the arts and science unit of the university. And then if our grades had been were satisfactory, then at our junior year, we were transferred to the College of Medicine and then the Department of OT. The primary theory courses and application courses and initial introduction to the clinical practice started in our junior year. After my junior year, I transferred down to University of Kansas, but my parents were both graduates of the University of Kansas, and they began to pressure me to transfer because they wanted me to be a part of the KU family. Also, Kansas University had a music therapy program as well as an OT program, and I decided I might be useful to have a double major. So I transferred down to the University of Kansas. Their program was quite heavy on arts and crafts classes. I was a member of the first class that did not have 12 months of field work in OT. I only had 10. So after I finished the courses, I was going to have 10 months of OT field work, which was called clinical affiliation back then. And music therapy required 9 months. I was frankly getting tired of school. So I decided to, cut my losses, and I finished the OT field work, that only part of the music therapy. I never was officially credentialed in music therapy, just in OT, but I was able to apply some of what I learned in music therapy along the way.
I could totally see that. So you mentioned that you were getting a little bit tired of school. That kind of brings me to my next question, where you went on to earn a master's at Western Michigan and a doctorate at the University of Washington. And at that time, very few OTs held doctoral degrees. What motivated you to go and pursue that level of scholarship after you were already getting kind of burnt out?
Yes. It became obvious to me that we were going to need more than a bachelor's degree, even though at the time I graduated, it was one of those things that I was going to start teaching. To be honest, I was not always very impressed with my instructors, and maybe naively, I thought I might be able to do a better job. I don't know whether I did, but but I guess I was willing to try. Yeah, in the academic world, I knew I would need more than a bachelor's degree. Western Michigan actually offered a master's degree in management and administration in OT. So I thought might as well pick up some additional credentials. I said again, my background and having worked in my parents' store helped me a lot in those courses. I did complete the master's degree. That also required a 3-month fieldwork experience, which I did at Heinz VA in Chicago. So I completed the master's degree and accepted a position at the University of Washington in Seattle, and again in a teaching position. So I had gone from clinician, and I was a clinician in mental health, which was called psychiatry at that point, at the University of Kansas Medical Center in Kansas City, before I went to get my master's degree. We have to keep the sequence straight there. I didn't go directly from undergraduate to
Yes, yes,
graduate.
yes.
Okay. And actually, the position I had at the University of Washington was part-time in teaching and part-time in the clinic, in the psychiatric unit. And that lasted a year, and then the administration decided that they wanted me full-time in teaching, so I got to train the next person to take over the psych part. There, of course, it also became evident that a master's degree was nice, but again, going to be acceptable even at that point if I was going to make academic my career. So I looked around for a school to accept me and thought that because of my background in mental health, that sociology or psychology would be good options.
Mm-hmm.
At
Yeah.
the University of Washington, both of them require that you complete the undergraduate courses. And back to my academic fatigue routine, I said, I don't think I want to do that. Special education did not require that you complete the undergraduate program in special ed. So I said, I think I'll do that. In the Seattle, Tacoma area, there were already OTs, particularly in Tacoma, practicing in the school settings, primarily with orthopedically handicapped who were separated. And this is before the IDEA, or the original legislation in 1975. So the idea of a doctorate in special education on top of my OT degree didn't seem far-fetched, but I wasn't totally out there in left field with what I was pursuing. So I completed my PhD in special ed at the University of Washington, and then accepted a position at the University of Oklahoma, which was in the process of developing some allied health programs, including OT. There was a large federal grant that was available at that point. That's why they were willing to do it. Once I was at the University of Oklahoma, my interest in history, which actually had started the first semester in my undergraduate, when my instructor said, well, there's not a lot written about OT. I was a history buff even in high school. So that was nothing new, just another aspect of my interest. And I said I actually did read the textbook. I know that reading textbooks is boring. The textbook wasn't quite as large as it is now. So the chapter on the history of OT was only about 20 pages, which I could hack. But I was impressed with what Dr. Denton had written about our founders. They seemed to be my kind of people. They were interested in what was going on. They apparently had reasonably good hand skills, and they were interested in serving their community, and those all seem useful ideas in my head. So they were creating what we now know as occupational therapy.
All right. Dr. Reed, you've described how your Master of Library Science degree transformed your ability to access information. Can you tell us about that aha moment when you started finding the founders' writing in unexpected places? Journals like Modern Hospital and the Boston Medical Surgical Journal.
Yes, it was an aha moment. Originally found these articles in the library at the University of Wisconsin. They didn't have good photocopy at that point, so I could look at them and admire them, but I didn't have my own copies until several years later. But the library at the University of Wisconsin was itself uh, a, a questionable place to pursue. The journals were in the basement of the library, and to access that, you went down a circular staircase built of cast iron that had been formed in a lattice, pattern. In other words, there were openings. You didn't dare go down those stairs in heels. You would have ended up breaking your neck. But also because there were openings in the staircase, if you got underneath the bottom one, you could watch people coming down the stairs. And I was always watching to see if some guy was down there checking women's underwear. So going down the stairs at the University of Wisconsin's library was itself an experience. Nevertheless, once you got down to the bottom of the stairs and determined that no one had watched you come down, that had any untoward interest. No, if they were watching you to come down safely, that yeah, that was very acceptable. They had these journals, and finding the early journals, there were a few references in our books which helped. But basically, I refer to it as reference hopping. One reference leads to another, leads to another, leads to another. So that there wasn't a nice printed out page of here are the 25 most useful articles about OT. Um, uh, in 1960. You found them at various means. The Surgeon General's Index, which predates the Index Medicus, was very helpful because they identified the journal articles. But the books showed up in what's known in the history of library science now as the Manzel collection. It's about 111 or 13, I don't remember, large volumes. that were essentially created by photocopying the catalog pages of some of the better university libraries. So when you looked into at them and you looked up subjects, yeah, you were actually looking at a miniature of the card catalog at the universities. And that's how I identified all the early OT texts, some of which weren't specifically OT, but were written by our early founders. A couple of the early ones are really about teaching handicraft to people with disabilities. And when they were writing the textbooks in 1913, they were not thinking of the term occupational therapy because it didn't exist yet. But the concept, in its broadest form, did. So that's how I identified the early books. And then over the years, through early booksellers, and then as we had more access to computerized systems, I was able to acquire copies of all of the early books so that I could read them at my leisure, not in the 2-week checkout period that most libraries would allow.
Yes. So, is there any particular story or discovery that you uncovered in your research that fundamentally changed how you see occupational therapy?
I don't know that I can identify a point,
Mhm.
or an article or a book. Each of the founders and the early writers said the theme that people with disabilities could be helped, and I'm using the word helped in a very broad sense, to better their lives or their conditions. It is prevalent. The ways in which the early leaders and founders went about it, creating a helping relationship with people with disabilities, it differed very much according to how they had come to appreciate is that, one, it could be done, and two, that there really was a rationale for doing it.
Mhm.
It's a thing to say, yes, yes, it can be done. There's another reason for saying, okay, let's do it. And so our founders came together from very diverse positions, but all with a view that, that these people that society saw as lesser individuals, and in some cases, if they couldn't shape up, again, using that term sort of in the vernacular, they were going to be warehoused somewhere. And that, and, th- and there was a better way, that they didn't all have to be warehoused. Eleanor Clark Slagle wrote a number of articles that appear in newspapers, not in any of our textbooks. But the newspapers, as you know, like personal interest stories. And so she talks about several of the clients that she worked with in Chicago. And really, her work early on was more in what we would now call vocational rehabilitation. So these were people who were viewed as being unemployable. One of the ones she talks about, a young man, apparently around 17, 18 range, um, accidentally got pinned in the ice storage company. Now, this is before refrigerators, in which we sometimes call a refrigerator an icebox. The people before refrigerators had ice boxes, and the people delivered a block of ice and put it in the one I knew best were lead covered, which slowed the melting of the ice. So he worked for a factory that created the ice blocks, and somehow or other he got caught in the refrigerator that made the icebox. And by the time they got him out, his feet had been frozen, so they were amputated. Well, back then, if you didn't have any feet, the employers looked at you as not employable. So he got referred to the organization that Slagle was working for, because it was either that or go to one of the state institutions for
Yeah.
people who can't manage for whatever reason. So she found he was really very skilled with his hands at carving, and so she taught him wood carving, and he got a job as a wood carver. And then they were willing to help him get what passed for artificial uh, feet at that point. So then he was able to walk again, and worked as a woodcarver. So she has a number of those kinds of stories. Other ones she does mention in one of the articles is a woman uh, who had been supported by her son. These were two immigrants, and the son died apparently of tuberculosis, although that may be questionable. So she was an older woman in her 60s at that point, and again, she seemed to have no means of support now that her son had died. So Slagle found out that she had once been very good at sewing quilts. So she helped the woman find some current designs that were popular, and the woman then was able to make quilts, which she sold, and then she was able to support herself. Otherwise, she would have ended up in an institution. So that's the kind of thing that she was looking at. Dr. Hall, who is not actually a founder, but was one of the early presidents, was initially running a psychiatric program for people mostly who had probably mostly depression. He didn't always bother to come up with a formal diagnosis. They were not cutting it in society. And so he started out with pottery, but actually ended up that most of the women were doing better with weaving. And so they stayed at a home that was common back then, that people had, essentially a boarding home. And then they came to this other house, which he had set up with weaving frames and weaving looms, and they learned how to weave. And back then, being able to weave various kinds of things, runners you know, for tables, blankets, Afghan kinds of things, allowed you to at least make a marginal living and kept you out of the psychiatric hospital.
Now, I mean, those stories are incredible, and I feel like they really capture the essence of what OT is, which is helping
Yeah,
people do what they want to do or
yeah,
need to do to be
yeah,
successful.
right. And the other thing is, you can tell is, although we don't teach and we don't use nearly as many arts and crafts, and in some settings we don't use them at all now. Back then, crafts were were a legitimate source of vocation. That you could live on the income that you created from your art and craft skills. Many women, it turned out, and in fact, one of our founders, Susan Johnson, was actually a dressmaker. That was her original career, because back then you didn't uh, hop in your automobile, because in like 1880, yeah, uh, there were none available. Even in 1917, not a lot of people owned cars. They were too expensive. Sort of on the line of owning your own airplane now. Yeah, some people could, but
Wow.
most people didn't. Most of us don't have an airplane sitting in our garage. So you had to have someone make dresses for you. You did not jump into your non-existent car and drive to the non-existent department store and say, I think I like this one. I'll try it on. If it fits, I'll buy it.
Mhm.
Uh, you had to have things made for you. So the ability to sew, to carve, to make quilts, to weave, were all legitimate occupations. My mother was very helpful in helping me understand the transition because she said, starting in the late 1920s and early 30s, advertisements used to talk about the fact that machine-made things were much superior to handcrafts, according to the advertisement. And so here's another one of those campaigns, which I've never really seen written up in the OT literature, what she talked about how essentially the push of the Industrial Revolution, which had started many years ago, but had really only began to take over in the US, basically downplayed the role of handcraft. And so it went from being a vocation to an avocation. So, as I said, my mother taught me a number of handcrafts. She was trying to keep me occupied. She wasn't really trying to teach me what she thought would be my eventual vocation, but also saw that if she could develop my hand skills, at least I might be employable at something somewhere along the line.
So, going off of the people like your mother who taught you these kinds of skills, who were some other mentors or colleagues along the way who kind of encouraged your passion for not only OT, but OT history?
Yeah, I'm not sure I can identify somebody who was really supported my OT history. I was able to corral some people, to help me do some writing, and I guess there were some people who didn't think it was crazy or a waste of time. But I'm not sure I can name a mentor in the OT world.
Really?
To me, the founders themselves were my mentors, even though obviously they were no longer physically available by the time I was in OT school. As I said, you know, I found their interest and their ability to articulate what they saw as the beginnings of OT. That spoke to me.
Mm.
Some later people were probably better at articulating some of the fundamentals that we all learn in OT school. A number of people helped refine some of those early ideas, things that are a little bit more recognizable to us today.
Yeah.
I just wrote an article. I'm just sending in the final proof of it. Henrietta McNary, who was president in the 90s, turns out to be one of the people who was probably better at articulating what we now recognize as the principles. Uh, so her writing, I said, I have read that before. In other words, people had read her stuff and now they were
Hmm.
reiterating it in theirs. And it's a case of, now I know some of the original source for that wording.
So, Dr. Reed, this will be my final question for today.
Okay.
But you say that the founders were kind of like your mentors. So, a lot of this, was it really self directed? How you kind of got into the history? Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Said, I'd always been in history. I found it fascinating in high school. One of my teachers finally told me to not raise my hand anymore because she knew I already knew the answers, and it was time to let some of my other classmates answer the questions. So I was not only interested, I was obviously learning. Now, my mother is responsible for taking me to the library so that so I knew how to use a catalog, a library catalog, before it all got computerized. So I knew she taught me some of the basics about how to find stuff. Then I said, "But I think the interest in history, I'm gonna have to lay on myself." For instance, early on when my mother would take me to the library, I wanted to go to the biography sections. Now, would have been for young readers. I remember there was a series of books, they were always bound in orange, but were written at, uh, 4th, 5th, 6th grade level. Um about various people. including George Washington and Abraham Lincoln and George Washington Carver and the people you all learned about somewhere in the history book. 'Kay. So there were stories about them. That's what I wanted to read. Now, my mother had majored in English lit, and so she wanted me to read Shakespeare. I didn't wanna read Shakespeare. So we had, disagreements about what books I was going to, check
Mhm.
out in the library. So I didn't wanna read novels. I wanted to read about real people. So you can say that when I started reading about the founders, they were real people.
Mhm.
So, whatever triggered that interest to start with, I really can't trace back. I
Mm.
just know that I liked reading about real people and what they had done and how they had managed to make a success of their life. Uh, and that I saw that real people making a success of their lives in our founders.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's so powerful.
So, I think that's one of those self-created. It said, if my mother had had her way, I'd have been reading novels and fiction.
Mhm.
So, and I stuck with it. Said I've always been fascinated by real people. Now, maybe because my early success in life, as you can tell, was somewhat limited. That may actually be the source. I saw myself as not doing very well, so I was interested in what made people do well.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. Oh my goodness. Your
Mm,
story is incredible. What really strikes me about your story, Dr. Reed, is how everything connects: the hobby shop, the overheard conversation, the willingness to keep learning and keep pushing. Occupational therapy has always been about seeing the meaningful threads in everyday life. And Dr. Reed has spent her entire career doing exactly that for our profession. So, in our next episode, we'll go deeper into the history itself, the founders, the core values, and the philosophical tensions that have shaped occupational therapy from its earliest days. Thank you for listening, and we will see you next time on Preserving Our Past and Forming Our Future.